Well, good morning and welcome to this seminar, Fraud and Pandemics from the Spanish Flu to the Present. My name is Graham Gordon and I'm delighted to be the chair of this session. And I'm equally delighted, if not more so, to introduce Michael Levi, who will be speaking. In the meantime, let me talk about some of our sponsors, which we'd like to thank, the platinum sponsors, gold, silver, bronze, and personal sponsors who've made it possible for us to put these seminars on for you today. Moving on, thank you. The personal sponsors, the bronze sponsors, the silver sponsors, which is coming up any moment, there we go, and of course the gold sponsors and then the platinum sponsors. Thank you all so much, because without these sponsors, these events would not be able to occur. I'm going to introduce Michael in a few moments. He's going to talk to us, as we said, on the Spanish flu, the pandemic, and such things. I've got to say, I apologize. I'm actually on vacation at the moment, but when Michael Minelli asked me if I would chair this meeting, I jumped at the chance, because Michael Levi and I have spoken in a previous seminar, and it was so fascinating. I was delighted to be able to come forward and help him out on this and to listen to what he has to say. Enough about me, however. Let's move forward to Michael. And this is today's agenda. Oh, we've gone too far. Today's agenda, Michael will talk, we'll have some Q&A, and then we'll move back to Michael for a wrap-up call, and thank you very much. So without more ado, less of me, more of Michael Levi. Thank you.
Okay, well, morning everyone, if you're in this time zone. Like fraud itself and its control, the picture on the slide is where we might like to be rather than where we are at the moment. Perhaps it might have been good to have entitled this Frauds and Pandemics, because one of my themes is going to be that using one label to describe a huge variety of different kinds of phenomena is actually not a great idea. I'll be making the same point about organized crime. Next slide, please. Great. Well, you can see the resemblance between me and Russell Crowe, at least if you've got bad eyesight. But the yes, no, back to, yeah, thanks. So I was commissioned by the Australian government to do a review with a colleague of mine from Australia a while back, and it started out as a small project, and like many of the projects I've been involved in over the decades, it grew. Since then, I've also got a small grant from the British Academy to look at fraud in the pandemics back to 1850, even before I was born. When I was a kid, the Dead Sea was only slightly sick. And also to look as far as we can at what evidence is available on the impact of the measures that have been taken around the world to deal with COVID pandemics. Next slide, please. So we're looking at pandemics, economic trends to which they're related, and fraud risks. And I think it's important to think, well, what is the effect of the pandemic, and not just on fraud itself, but on our reactions to fraud, because those things are intimately linked. One of my favorite quotes from Warren Buffett is that you only find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. There aren't any, as far as I know, extant photos of me being in that condition, or even of Matt Hancock. But we do need to factor in the length of time that it takes before conduct that we define as corruption or fraud emerges, if it ever does, in our analysis of the linkages. And one of the themes that I'm going to stress is that different sorts of fraud have a different kind of time to awareness, and therefore we can expect differences as time goes on. And we need to separate out prevention and resilience efforts, administrative controls, and policing and criminal justice controls. Now everybody now has to ritually say lessons learned. I'm going to query whether we actually are likely to learn lessons from this crisis. We always say that we do, but as is often the case in the real world, what we say about what we're going to learn may be different from what we actually learn. There's not a slide for this, but those of us who are acquainted with the fraud literature are familiar with the concept of the classic fraud triangle, which is basically pressure on you, motivation, and rationalizations of fraud. Now, that was developed originally for embezzlers, and the whole point is that embezzlers, accountants generally, are often anyway, by virtue of their job, in a position already to defraud. It applies less easily to people who want to maneuver themselves to be in a position to defraud, and therefore you need a slightly different complex, and they may not be as wedded to respectability and find rationalization as difficult as to those of us who are in respectable jobs and are attached to that view. In the routine activities models of crime, we also often think about the targets of crime, and we also think about third parties. In the literature, this is called capable guardianship, who might be able to intervene to stop crimes. And those are issues that I want to focus on. In cyberspace, physical capable guardians are less important, as we've seen, for example, in the raft of ransomware attacks that we're suffering from at the moment. Next slide, please. So when we think about classifying and analyzing scams, I've already mentioned the problem I have about the term organized crime. It's often very loosely defined. It's often evoking images of pyramids of mafia-type groups. Those mafia-type groups do exist, but for fraud, what we have to think of, what kind of organizational format do we need in order to be able to accomplish frauds? And that could be just one person, or it could be a small group of networks. It often falls short of the kind of evidence the police might be looking at in order to constitute an organized crime group. And that's very important when we come to analyze shifts in criminal behavior. And also changes in target and third-party defender conduct. Frauds against individuals, online, offline, and quite often nowadays blended. Frauds against business, whether it's staff involvement, not necessarily as the sole perpetrator, or ransomware. Frauds against government, both new and old opportunities. And data collection and validation issues often change over time. We need to think about the impact of technologies on that. There are market opportunities in prevention as well. We often use fear or concern about crime to sell things like, for example, antivirus software. But are there also market failures in prevention? I'm going to suggest that there are, partly because apart from kite marking and ISO number type standards issues, it's very difficult to tell people, well, actually that product is not very good, you really shouldn't be using it. This product is a lot better. It's very difficult for people in public service particularly to do that, because they might be accused of breach of standards or even of corruption. Next slide, please. Now, one of the interesting things that I found when going back to Spanish flu and doing a lot of research on the history of this is that there's almost no mention of fraud or corruption in the whole of the literature, medical and non-medical, about Spanish flu. Almost the only examples are those of companies, many of whom you'll still recognize, who advertise themselves as strengthening their ability to deal with Spanish flu, improving your resistance. It may be some of those adverts would have to be taken down, but there was no advertising standards authority to require that then. And so you got quite a lot of perhaps shaded behavior by major corporations. Next slide, please. So what's new this time? I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic is the first systematic approach that I have seen, and I actually started researching fraud in 1972, so that's quite a long time, to combating health and financial scams during a pandemic or even during an epidemic in the UK or anywhere else in the world. There was, right at the beginning, a much more systematic approach. The National Cybersecurity Centre, the much criticised Action Fraud, the UK Finance, CIFAS, and a host of other bodies really made a determined effort to try to warn, particularly people in customer-facing roles, about, or business-facing roles, about the risks of fraud, which had never happened before in any previous health crisis. And it's tied to more general contemporary concerns about the impact of the internet and social media on fraud, and for that matter on politics, affecting the general public. Now you can read public-facing warnings against consumer and investment scams have been proliferating. Google, etc., and other bodies have been doing scam watch. But I have to emphasize that they're still taking money from scammers for putting their scams at the top of the list. And that is something that really needs to stop. But we know very little about the effectiveness of these warning techniques. There's almost no published data and very little private data about how good these warnings are. How often you visit a website is not a good measure of that kind of thing. We need to get a lot more sophisticated about it. But there's no pandemic-related public advice that relates to reducing frauds committed by senior executives or to reducing corruption with the collusion of politicians. That's not very surprising, but it's an important thing to bear in mind. Most of the stuff has been warning the general public about what they can or should or might do, rather than about these more background and often more heavy crimes. And of course, a lot of elite blue collar and organized crime frauds go on independently. So what we need to work out is the equivalent of excess deaths in the fraud sphere, and that's a very tricky thing to do. So pandemics alter the shape of opportunities and the pressures on individuals, but they don't dominate the levels of fraud or other economic crimes. Next slide, please. In fact, skip this one. Skip it. Next, please. Now, UK Finance has got this helpful monthly warnings. These are not intended to be pure data point developments in the timing of scams, but they're all relatively short cycles from operation to victim or third-party detection. I'm leaving successful interventions, including criminal justice pursuit, out of the picture for the moment, and they're not included on this slide. Next slide, please. So what's the evidence so far? Well, we've got improved data from banks, police, and general population surveys, though the ONS crime survey is not yet available for much of this period. And the UK bank data shows slight fall in frauds, even online frauds. But of course, this may be the result of the intervention methods that we've been applying. So it's difficult to know what it might have been, what the counterfactual would have been. There have been big public education campaigns, huge frauds or alleged corruption. I've changed the wording there, against public purse. The Fraud Advisory Panel has been trying to get the Treasury to publish data about the identities of everybody receiving public help or companies, but for reasons that are obscure, they haven't done that. The Cabinet Office has attempted to get a lot of cross-government coordination, and they've done a better job than in any previous crisis at doing that. And there are, of course, also the chumocracy allegations with which we are distressingly familiar about bypassing formal procurement. Of course, in some countries, for example, Brazil, there's currently allegations that the government deliberately grossly overpaid for a poorly performing vaccine in order to skim money off the top. We haven't had any of that kind of thing in the UK, but you know, it's been announced there's nearly 13,000 investigations by HMRC, but that's only a fraction of the million businesses that have used the furlough scheme, and out of the 64 billion or so. I've got some data, it's not yet available, but if you look at the trend diagram of Australian ScamWatch data, for example, that shows a pretty large increase. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And those are UK bank fraud losses. What they show is that many types of fraud, of at least debit and credit card fraud, have fallen. The area that's increased is the e-commerce fraud. Next slide, please. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about the impacts of the global financial crisis. I may be wrong, but there may be one coming to a country near you. The credit squeeze brings a lot of frauds to light. It's masked by the general levels of insolvency and creditors' unwillingness to pursue. And I want us to think about pre-pack administration in this kind of context. Maybe on balance, pre-packs are a good thing, but they certainly facilitate phoenixism, which then is unlikely to be defined as fraud, but it may actually be fraud. So it depends on incentives. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah, thank you. Official resources are easy to find to deal with stigmatized group and for asset recovery than to deal with more elite suspects. That's just a political fact of life, because it requires a lot of effort to prosecute. You know, if for example, we get a case like the H-Boss Reading fraud, then that can consume the entire resources of an entire police unit for a year, which means they can't deal with anything else. There are clear positive net returns for more tax fraud investigators, but elite staff investigators need to be trained. You know, the government has promised 1,000 extra people, but they don't grow on trees. They'll probably be reallocated from other functions in part. And we need to be realistic about what those extra resources can achieve in the context of the scale of the problem. Next slide, please. One of the things that we know about the impacts of the general global financial crisis is that more individuals take bigger risks to pay to obtain jobs from gangmasters or to get better returns from investments or pension schemes. And this leads to a bigger supply of victims. Now, fast forwarding to the present, with negative or ultra low interest rates, temptations are greater still. Real interest rates are not a concept widely understood by ordinary people. And so we can expect a lot more of this kind of scam as things go forward. Next slide, please. So the global financial crisis, you know, recoveries remained and still remain pretty pitiful as a proportion of the scale of the problem. Does this matter? Is prevention not the key rather than criminal justice for these events? It's commonly accepted that we can't prosecute our way out of the situation. You know, looking at things today, little evidence of predicted boom in insider frauds yet, or organized crime involvement in fraud. There's better evidence of that. But we do need to link more data. One of the things I would strongly recommend we do at the moment, and we should have been doing it already, is more social network analysis. That's what SNA stands for, to try and, you know, link the background of what appear to be different corporations involved in loan schemes. Yeah, and that is an area of much better intelligence that we've developed. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of fraud warnings. I'm just going to skate through them. They're just visuals for you to see. Next slide, please. You know, we can see that warnings have been adopted for different kinds of phenomena. Are you able to move on? Whether it's courier frauds, whether it's hacking prevention, whether it's pet frauds. If it's not working, it doesn't matter. Romance frauds. Many of you may think that all romance is a fraud, but we'll leave that particular issue aside. So I will move to the conclusion that I've got, which is that apart from government loans and anti-COVID purchasing, there's probably not a tsunami tide of new fraud. Maybe there will be one if there's a recession, but there certainly has been and will be revealed when those loans come through and crystallize. There'll be a tsunami of frauds against government loans. How many of those will actually be dealt with as fraud remains to be seen. Many, but not all, online offenders will be in hard-to-reach countries without easy extradition, or they'll be in jurisdictions where there's some level of political protection for offenders. And this is a challenge for prosecutor autonomy, integrity, and reputation. But we will need to, next slide, please. And the next one. We'll need to watch out for a lot more management frauds in future. And cross-border cooperation and public-private cooperation remain crucial in reducing fraud and stopping the outflows of money. And basically, the faster we stop frauds via data sharing and outreach to those at risk, and by active auditing, the less harm is done. Those are the key messages I wanted to get across. So we need to think about the changes that there have been in target and victim behavior. Obviously, working from home was predicted to lead to a large increase in fraud and perhaps blackmail, but that hasn't been an obvious result so far in the data, but we can expect to see more of it as things emerge. And the final thing is that what are we going to do in terms of pursuing and trying to get back the money? And what is the role of criminal justice in all of this? Because even though criminal justice is not realistic for most of these frauds, there's still an issue about justice that people care about. And there's also an issue about reassurance policing, that something is being done. And this legitimacy point is an important point that we can easily forget when we're looking at the technicalities of prevention. So thanks very much for listening. Sorry the slides didn't work as seamlessly, but not that important in the final analysis.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Despite the technological issues, it was, as I expected, it was a tour de force. And so thank you. I would ask everyone, if you have the questions for Michael, to please put them in the chat bar, and I will pass them on to him as I'm about to do. The first one, if I may, Michael, you mentioned that the pandemic appears to be the first time when there were certain government agencies creating warnings in advance, as it were, or as it was evolving, about the fraud and investment scams, etc. Is this just, the question is this just because of the significant IT or electronics interaction that is now occurring? Or is it more that is it more that fraud levels are more in the government minds, or is it something else? Because you mentioned the sort of CFG, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Better question than my answer is going to be. I think it's there is more. Fraud is more in the government's mind than it was. I mean, I was involved in the 2006 government fraud review, which the Attorney General led, Peter Goldsmith. And at that time, there was quite a big awareness and a reshaping of the boundaries, but that rather slipped away. So I think it's not just government awareness, it's also private sector awareness and bank awareness. But I do think that the technology function has been pretty critical in terms of communicating messages. And of course, so many more people are now buying stuff online or seeing adverts for investment online than was the case, and via social media. So we can't entirely separate out these issues.
Thank you. I reiterate to our viewers that and listeners that please do send your questions through the chat bar, and I will ask. Moving on, if I may, you mentioned towards the end about justice and the fact that the criminal justice as opposed to justice with a capital J, if you will, and people feeling that the fraudsters are being brought to book. Now, to what extent do you think, or are you proposing that actually without outside of the criminal justice, there's still a justice element to for the government or the law enforcement to evoke.
Yeah, I think there is an element of justice, and I know that some police forces around the country are struggling hard, and prosecutors to bring cases. I think, if we look at the broad spectrum of fraud, from the serious fraud office to what a local police force and CPS would deal with, or trading standards are also important in this spectrum, then we'll see that, as has always been the case with HMRC policy, that a sample of cases is being dealt with in a criminal justice way pour décourager les autres. And, we don't know very much about how good that messaging is in deterrent terms. What's our target audience for it? Existing criminals, potential criminals, but there's also reassurance for the public that people are not getting away with things that they find outrageous. So it's a balance of issues. Justice has perhaps been in shorter supply than many people, including me, might hope. But it never was richly supplied. It was more when I did a review for the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice in 1992-3. It was in more plentiful supply then, but there was never a golden age of prosecuting white-collar crimes. But I think it's fair to say that resources were cut back. And if you're going to deal with a very influential and powerful target, you need a lot more resources to deal with that than an ordinary one. But I think people have been unduly dispirited. I think where we need to get to is that a lot of small frauds are not that complicated to deal with. People get put off by the term. But we need to think about what forensic skills and data skills do we really need for what sorts of frauds. And I think that's the way to get to. So yes, we do need more resources. Where's that going to come from? Political will.
Can I just say, on a purely personal note, back to a comment you made earlier, as a qualified chartered accountant and someone who leads a chartered accountant, an accountancy firm or group of firms, it's accountants get a bad name. It's qualifications and all of that. However, I digress. Question: you obviously brought up the Spanish flu, and you said that you showed the potential fraudulent claims of Bovril and Oxo and various other entities at the time. But you also mentioned that a lot of the issues this time with finding or prosecuting the individuals are because then they're transnational, or they have other political support, shall we say, from outside the country. To what extent, I mean, what does your research show, the extent that this is the primary source or the larger section of the fraudulent population, shall we say?
Well, we don't know what the exact distribution is, because to know that, we'd have to follow up on all the frauds that get reported. And the background linkage, that was one of the things I highlighted as a way forward, is done more in the private sector and up to a point by HMRC than it is in routine cases. But I think it is fair to say that foreign organized networks and groups are responsible for a significant percentage. It would be absurd to say what percentage, because we just don't know. But a lot of the stuff is actually done by smaller local networks, and some of it is done, if it's not too complicated, by existing crime groups that just think, oh, here's a good opportunity. If they happen to know people, not of your distinguished accounting body, but other enablers that they meet, they haven't been able to meet them so easily during COVID, that they happen to meet who can kind of help them develop their schemes, then they'll move into that, just as the long-firm fraudsters that I studied in the 70s did. So it's a question of what can produce a step change in that process. And we know that a lot of the foreign groups already have that step change. They've just adapted what they were doing anyway to a COVID environment. But this is where the reforms in Companies House, in the controls of beneficial ownership, are so important, and they need to be done in real time. And I can't stress enough, we need to be able to react faster. It's not enough to be able to trace these connections after the money's gone.
On that same stream, you mentioned pre-packs and the obvious, shall we say, ability for people to lose money or cut off the connection to the money by going through the pre-packs. What would you, I mean, what does your research suggest changes should be made, assuming that pre-packs carry on, to try and prevent the fraudster using a pre-pack as a way of disposing of the money or removing the money?
Well, I think we probably, it's a very complicated question, and I haven't been researching it intensively, but I would say that what we need to do is to check the number of previously delinquent directors more carefully. We need to resource the insolvency service and incentivize firms to report this more and act on it. It's a question of creating an intelligence database to deal with this. There's no reason why, and I know that Dun & Bradstreet and Experian, for example, used to operate this kind of data set, and the insolvency service used to. But we need to think about this as a systemic problem that we've got to tackle. It's unfortunate, but the real world, if people get away with it once or twice, but it's when we have systematic phoenixisms, as places like the Mail on Sunday reporter Tony Hetherington is often stressing, we need to take more notice of these events and have more systemic interventions to try and ensure that people don't do it as easily as they used to be. I mean, we know that the legal cases that follow this sometimes fail, and for defamation reasons, I won't give you any examples. But it is very important to maintain, to keep the faith and improve our skill sets in dealing with them, because it's an important source of quasi-criminal abuse. I won't put it higher than that.
Thank you. Well, I appear to have run out of questions, but I'm sure there are others, which I'm sure the members of the audience will want to ask at some stage. So we have put connections on the chat bar, both for Michael, should you wish it, and myself, should you wish to ask me a particular question. That'd be very strange, but I'm happy to answer the questions. And they're on the chat bar, so please do get in touch. In closing, if we can have the next slide, I'm going to yet again thank our sponsors, the bronze, silver, gold, and platinum sponsors, and the personal sponsors. without whom the FS Club will be unable to put such events on. And thank you so much, Michael. It has been yet again a pleasure, and I'm delighted that I was asked to chair this, because I'm so glad we were able to talk through, and it has been refreshing. I am on vacation, and this is a vacation event that I was looking forward to. Thank you. Let me remind you now about the upcoming events, as you can see them on your screen now. Monday the 5th of July is not just the day that Boris is going to tell us whether we're going to be free or not, but it's also between 1600 and 1645, we've got the psychology of seduction, which I don't think Boris and his cabinet really need to know too much about, given the previous events. However, then on Thursday, the 8th of July at 1500, that's 3 o'clock for those of you in old money, the Financial Centres of the World 2021 focus on British Virgin Islands. As you know, the FS Club and Yazen Group are very close, and they have the index of the Financial Centres of the World, and so this would be an excellent opportunity to look at the British Virgin Islands, one of the key areas. In fact, as Michael knows, probably one of the areas where we have issues with this particular topic as well. However, on Tuesday the 13th at 11 o'clock in the morning to 11:45, there's the ESOP sofa, hot topics of employee share ownership. I know I've been involved in an ESOP before now, and it's been very worthwhile, but they have to be looked at particularly careful, or else you can actually do the exact opposite of that which is intended. So that's Tuesday the 13th at 11 o'clock in the morning. And Wednesday the 14th of July, the Nifty 50, true story behind the infamous stock bubble. For those of you who saw it in passing, there have been a number of such events that Michael alluded to in one of his slides earlier, with not quite the South Sea bubble, but various other events going along. To find out more about any kind of these events, please do go to the website, which is down below, fsclub.ez.com/events/forthcoming-events/. So, thank you one and all. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, maybe even more. But it was really good news. Michael, thank you once again.
It's been a great pleasure. And remember, the frauds. There's one fraudster put it when I said, "What's the code of the underworld?" Do your friends first; they're easier.
I keep my hands in my pockets in that case. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Michael, and thank you one and all. And we look forward to seeing you again on Monday the 5th of July for the psychology of seduction. Thank you. Bye-bye.